there. Yeah. Well, anyone. Good morning to you all. Thank you for coming. We have the pleasure to having here with us Professor David Leslie. He's the ethics team lead at the Alan Turing Institute. He will be moderated and comment by the Director of Public Transformations, Bachelors of Tech de Monterrey, Miguel Ángel Toro. So I will leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Hello, everyone. How are you? Good morning for us that are in Mexico City, and good afternoon, Professor Leslie, you are on the other side of the world, in the UK. So let me a little bit talk about what we've been doing here over the last couple of days. So welcome, everyone, to day number 5 of the second New Data and Methods for Generating Official Information series of conferences organized by the Instituto Nacional de Estadística y Geografía, the INEGI from Mexico, and the School of Social Sciences and Government of the Tecnológico de Monterrey. So as Ricardo mentioned, my name is Miguel Toro. I'm the head of the undergraduate program on government and public transformation, and I'll be your host today. So over the last couple of days, we've heard from various experts regarding diverse topics such as health economics, macro forecasting, crime perception, among different other topics. And however, I do think that today's conference may be one of the most interesting ones, as it'll cover the ethical issues around the use of artificial intelligence and big data. And to talk about these issues, we have the honor of having David Leslie with us from the Alan Turing Institute. But before I give the floor to David, I'll read just a little bit of his impressive resume. So David is currently the Alan Turing Institute's ethics team lead. But before that, he has been a distinguished researcher, professor, and collaborator at universities like Princeton, Yale, Harvard, the MIT, and Boston University. His research has revolved around the intersection between ethics, politics, and the use of new technology like artificial intelligence. He also serves as an elected member of the Bureau of the Council of Europe's Ad hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, on the editorial board of the Harvard Data Science Review magazine, as well as being a founding editor of the Springer journal AI and Ethics. Additionally, he is the author or co-author of multiple works related to the use of artificial intelligence in various fields, with his work being published by the UK's government and its Information Commissioner's Office, the Nesta Innovation Foundation, the Japanese National Research and Development Institute RIKEN, among others. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to David Leslie from the Alan Turing Institute. David, you have 35 minutes for your presentation, while I'll be gathering the questions that the audience members may pose through the chat. And after your presentation, we will have a little bit of time to answer all of their questions. So thank you once again, all, for coming. And thank you, David, for allowing us to hear your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Miguel. And if there's any problems with my audio as I go on, just shout, because I'm going to be looking at my screen, not at the Zoom. So I thought I'd take the opportunity in talking to you today. We're not going to do any slides. I'm just going to give you the kind of old school lecture. We have a lot of technology nowadays, so I said to myself, we're gonna do it the way it used to be done. I'm going to write a lecture. We're going to have a nice conversation afterwards. So. I think that what's as a starting point, I just want you to step back for a moment and think of the talk I'm going to give as trying to widen our lens and think about the kind of big picture of where AI and big data are situated as we kind of set the direction of travel for our shared future. And if I go slightly over 35, also, Miguel, just scream and let me know, and I'll stop.
Yeah, don't worry.
Okay. So in the final pages of their popular 2013 book, The New Digital Age, Google executives Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen portray the coming of a brave new world that is organized into 2 distinct realities, one virtual and one physical. Describing the character of this emerging digital future involves, they write, telling, quote, a tale of 2 civilizations, unquote. For the virtual and the physical worlds are not merely independent of each other, but develop on their own tracks and at their own paces. As might be expected, such a splitting or bifurcating picture of reality has direct consequences for the rights and freedoms of its fleshly occupants. Schmidt and Cohen explain, quote, as in a social contract, users will voluntarily relinquish things they value in the physical world, privacy, security, personal data, in order to gain the benefits that come with being connected to the virtual world, end quote. Viewed with the aid of just over half a decade of hindsight, Schmidt and Cohen's dualistic vision of a digital society organized neatly into virtual and physical domains seems to be ontologically quaint, if not morally suspect. What this dichotomous picture of social existence seems to fail accurately to reflect is the dynamic reality of the integrated platform infrastructure that animates and sustains today's big data society. With the rise of the Internet of Things, edge computing, the automation of the workplace, and the smartification of basically everything, AI systems are progressively more coming to comprise the cyber-physical frame and fabric of networked society. We increasingly live in a dynamic and integrated digital world where connected devices containing countless sensors and sites of behavioral measurement intermingle with omnipresent algorithmic systems and cloud computing platforms. In this connected world, digital and material realities shade off into each other to the point of indistinction. Indeed, such an agile intermeshing of the virtual and the physical also operates as a generative mechanism within society itself. In this cyber-physical condition, algorithmically personalized services reach into the unwitting private lives of targeted decision subjects and have an active curatorial hand in real-life processes of identity formation, while opaque computational methods of relevance ranking, popularity sorting, trend predicting, search engines produce calculated digital publics bereft of any sort of participatory or social choice. Now, considered in this light, Schmidt and Cohen's assertion that one could justifiably surrender tangible legal rights to privacy, to security, and to the protection of personal data in exchange for the jackpot of benefits ethereally contained in the virtual world would seem perilously naive, if not entirely aloof to the precarious biopolitics of the digital that is constitutive of big data society itself. Now, I want to take this short time I have here today to suggest without hyperbole that the coming computational ubiquity, the coming omnipresence of this cyber-physical reality, which is spurring the emergence of this kind of in-between interstitial condition, is bringing us to nothing less than a civilizational tipping point. For better or worse, AI systems are ever more being directed at an increasingly unbounded problem space, an increasingly limitless field of potential applications. As general purpose technology, AI is not simply penetrating into veritably every domain of human practice. The complex assemblage of AI systems is itself coming to constitute the critical cyber-physical infrastructure of connected society writ large. And as intelligent algorithmic systems are consequently becoming gradually more pervasive across all sectors of society, as the scope of its impact stretches from the depths and shallows of personal intimacy and social connection to the biospheric fate of the future of life itself, humanity is being drawn closer and closer to a kind of critical threshold beyond which its social reality, its world of shared experience, will fundamentally and perhaps irretrievably change. But what will the shape of that society of tomorrow take? How will the values and motivations that are currently driving the gathering energies of technological advancement and artificial intelligence both come to influence that future society's forms of life and transform the identities of us, its warm-blooded subjects? How will the factors that are bringing us ever closer to this socio-technical tipping point also mold the contours of the novel state of affairs on the other side of that societal sea change? Now, these are salient and open ethical questions, questions that, from a moral point of view, should be shaping the public discourse on the direction of AI innovation. For it is only by prioritizing considerations of the beliefs and intentions behind the trajectories of technological advancement that societal stakeholders will come to be able to take the reins of AI and to steer the course of its innovations in accordance with a shared and democratically articulated vision of the future. Indeed, what makes these open ethical questions so crucial at the moment is that the developmental path of innovation in AI has left the most important of their answers in the lap of the moral agency of the present. Artificial intelligence is not simply a general purpose technology like, say, steam power or electricity. It is more essentially a gatekeeper technology that uniquely holds the keys both to the potential for the exponential advancement of human well-being, but also to possibilities for the humanly prompted generation of global catastrophic and extinction scale risks. It is yet humankind, so us, people, that must ultimately choose which direction the key will turn, whether it is towards the future flourishing of our species and to the sustainability of our biosphere, the summum bonum, as the Greeks would say, the greatest good for all, or toward the anthropogenic realization of its most destructive possibilities, the summum malum, the greatest bad of humanity. Taking first from the side of human welfare, it is undeniable that the pervasiveness of measurement and of digital interconnectedness in the cyber-physical world is delivering rapid gains in the power of AI to improve the provision of essential social goods and services. We see this across a wide spectrum of human interests and needs, from healthcare, education, and transportation, to food supply, energy, and environmental management. And as more and more data are collected through the continuous operation of this networked infrastructure, AI and machine learning systems, which organically improve with the expanding availability of data, will only become more effective and useful. This expanding social utility is already evident in the emerging capacities of AI innovations to foster individual well-being and to expand possibilities for self-actualization. In the sphere of education, for instance, AI systems are being developed to widen accessibility and inclusivity of open educational resources so that the talents and intellectual potentials of more than just the socioeconomically and geopolitically privileged few can be identified, enabled, and cultivated. Driven by policy goals to close the domestic and global digital divides, these digital affordances hold the promise of helping to equalize material conditions of social justice and equitable opportunity to flourish the world over. In the field of healthcare too, AI innovations are enabling researchers and practitioners to tend to human well-being and to improve the lives of the vulnerable and the infirmed in unprecedented ways. In the context of the current global public health crisis, AI and machine learning technologies are augmenting human capacities to better tackle the clinical and epidemiological challenges of COVID-19. Such interventions range from AI-supported radiological diagnostics, clinical prognostics, pharmaceutical discovery, and test kit development, to methods of protein and RNA profiling that are shedding light on virus function and disease progression. Likewise, in the areas of research support, vast troves of existing biomedical literature are being mined by AI technologies to identify clinically established drugs and treatment methods that may be of use in fighting SARS-CoV-2 infection. In the domain of epidemiological modeling too, the high-dimensional processing capacity of AI applications are helping scientists to generate more effective real-time forecasts of the spread of infection and of the location of potential outbreaks. Stepping outside the circumstances of the pandemic, though, biomedical applications in AI are also allowing doctors to better target cancer drugs, to more effectively detect cardiovascular disease and degenerative neurological conditions. And they're helping surgeons carry out delicate procedures with previously inconceivable superhuman precision. Medical imaging AI have already made immense progress in the early diagnosis of breast cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, eye disease, and chronic heart failure. But beyond these widening gains at the agent level, advancements in AI and machine learning are also affecting the public interest on a societal and biospheric scale. By combining motion sensor recording with object classification algorithms and high-dimensional analytics, AI systems are beginning to revolutionize the study of biodiversity and the field of conservation biology. They are thereby opening crucial paths to possible redress in the wake of man-made mass extinction. Other kinds of AI piloted technologies are helping to combat deforestation and illegal poaching. And through crop monitoring and analysis, they are improving agricultural science, yielding new insights and methods that will potentially support sustainable farming across the planet. More significant still is the potential for the use of networked AI systems at scale to directly combat the forces of underlying climate change. In their capacity to extract subtle patterns from high-dimensional feature spaces that far exceed human skill comprehensibility. The complex algorithmic systems are assisting climatologists and environmental scientists in processes of scientific discovery. They are enabling them to build better models of global warming and environmental hazards, and to better predict catastrophic storms, fires, flood, and drought. Now, to step back for a second, even this incomplete picture of the spectrum of constructive potentials to press AI innovation into the service of human flourishing and to the sustainability of planetary life should awaken us to the ethical and practical demands which derive from its exceptional status as a gatekeeper technology. As AI systems are increasingly developing into non-substitutable supports for the provision of critical social goods and services, as they are thus coming to be gatekeepers for the advancement of vital public interests and sustainable human development, these systems are also consequently becoming a sort of global public utility. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what does this mean? What does it mean that AI might be a global public utility? Now, the concept of public utility is, of course, nothing new. Buried deep in the English common law tradition in a 1670 work entitled De Portibus Maris, Sir Matthew Hale first defined public utilities as those social goods that are affected with the public interest, and thus cease to be justifiably placed under the control of private law alone. By extension, Hale's idea is that establishing a public utility becomes necessary where the provision of a good or service is of sufficient social value to be a necessity, and where the provision of this necessity is at risk of subversion or corruption if left to private interests or market forces. This point is really made by Sabeel Rahman in some of his interesting work. Over the course of modern times, public utility frameworks have been anchored in the common law tradition, where industries affected with the public interest have been designated as common characters or public callings. Such industries whose production of goods and services required market consolidation of the support that limited ordinary accountability mechanisms have been subjected to special restrictions, such as the duty to serve all comers, to demand reasonable prices, and to offer benefits to the public universally, even-handedly, and fairly. This is where some in big tech might feel a little uncomfortable. Indeed, the basic concept of the need for public utilities has evolved over the last 100 years by way of the protracted confrontations between public advocates and incipient forms of unrestrained domination. Confrontations such as those arising in the United States between the New Deal progressives of the early 1920s and the private power of the mass monopolistic corporations that had emerged out of the economic windfalls of industrialization. The basic idea of public utility capture is simply that social governance of essential industries that unlock access to vital goods and services, and that thus control crucial dimensions of the common good without corresponding checks on the exercise of that authority, must be ensured so that the public can be protected against the considerable moral and societal hazards that attend leaving the access key of those vital goods and services in the hands of potentially unchecked market power and private influence. What is unique about AI systems in this context, however, is that the scope of their social and ethical impact exceeds any arbitrarily delimited geopolitical boundaries that might circumscribe notions of the common public good or public interest within local or national peripheries. To be sure, given their unbounded problem space, the globally ramifying nature of their innovation-spawning character, and their potential for universal and protracted aggregate impacts, artificial intelligence technologies trigger a kind of more moral rescaling imperative, whereby the ethical demands arising from design and implementation of AI systems, in a sense, echo outwards from the agent to the community, to the species, and ultimately to the biosphere. They ethically implicate the producers of those systems at each step of the way. This is especially true of the potential for asymmetrically distributed benefits of AI innovations to have devastating downstream effects on the vulnerable and digitally disenfranchised stakeholders most impacted by widening and historically entrenched patterns of local and global inequality. Were AI systems to be reconceived as global public utilities, their producers and deployers would have to meet ever greater demands to design and implement their technologies ethically, equitably, and sustainably, to serve cooperatively articulated human ends, and to harness the productive power for the purposes of advancing what the philosopher John Stuart Mill once called, quote, the permanent interests of man or humanity as a progressive being. Such a charge to serve the common good entails that these producers and deployers would not just be endowed with a positive responsibility to contribute to the provision of vital human necessities. It entails that they would be endowed with a negative responsibility to not exploit for private gain the station of providing social essentials and necessary common stocks, either by exercising illicit, harmful, or coercive influence on affected stakeholders and decision subjects, or by collecting inequitable rent or toll for access to the critical cyber-physical infrastructure shared in common and by all. Now, a demand to reconceive the assemblage of AI systems as a global public utility is, of course, and admittedly, tantamount to rattling on the gates of existing technological power, both economic and political. But from both practical and human scientific points of view, as engaged questioners, and as responsible researchers and innovators, rattle and bang, we must. Standing at these gates, we must study and interrogate this form of power, no matter how imposing, secreted, or elusive it may be. We must seek it out in the machineries of administration and governmentality that draw on automation to bridle the poor and to reign over the oppressed. And we must track it in the agenda-setting tactics and evasionist stratagems of the big tech boardroom. We must hunt for it in the continuous production of impoverished reflexivity and surveillant anxiety that has emerged from the growing ecosystem of distraction technologies, such as smartphones, and the compulsion-forming reputational platforms of social media. We must search for it in all the dispersed predictive and architectural subtleties of algorithmic systems themselves, and in the proprietary and semantic opaqueness, the black box, if you will, that so enshrouds a lot of them. And we must hold all of these socio-technical manifestations of power accountable and compel them to serve the real interests of the individuals and communities they affect. For as we approach the critical threshold of the present civilizational tipping point, the greatest threats posed by artificial intelligence technologies to the future of society are situated unambiguously in their liability to be appropriated by the persistent exercise of domination and in the concealed corridors of power. Now, to be clear, along with the unprecedented societal benefits that the accelerating pace of AI and machine learning is already producing, have come large-scale dangers of systematic abuse and global catastrophic risks. Dangers and risks whose origins lie in the cascading exercise of both visible and invisible forms of power. Critics have for some time voiced legitimate concerns about the hazards of mass economic displacement that have been steered by the profitability gains yielded by automation, and by the dangers to civil liberties and societal freedom posed by the rise of so-called surveillance capitalism's big tech-driven political economy. This is the kind of extractive political economy that Shoshana Fellman has written a lot about. They've also rightly observed how widespread government use of digital tracking and automated decision-making can function to reinforce deep-seated patterns of inequality and marginalization. As they have shown, and they have shown how the radically centralized platform infrastructure of certain batteries of algorithmic systems also allow them to subtly form and norm subjectivities, identities, and to constitute and codify the public squares, the public sphere they only claim to measure. Still, the capacity of AI technologies deployed at scale to enable the emergence of incipient forms of digital despotism is now raising problems of a different order. The current shift to critical digital infrastructures and to a politics of macro-scale grid control is giving centralized political authorities the ability to engage in almost unlimited human monitoring, peremptory calculation, and mass behavioral manipulation. In China, for instance, the long-term pursuit of effective social management through grid-organized methods of surveillance, censorship, and disciplinary control has been exponentially bolstered by the aggressive development of human targeting AI. China's much maligned social credit system has in fact been designed to carry out such a project of social governance through the coalescence at the population level of big data analytics and the autocratic assertion of individually curated political control. But more troubling still, this Chinese case simply represents the vanguard of many imminent possibilities for the development of novel political shapes of algorithmically enabled authoritarianism around the globe. The potential for such an impending rise of digital autocracy is made more realistic by its prospects for economic viability. Unlocking the potential of AI and data-driven innovation has meant a disentanglement of the social and political conditions of economic success from the norms of freedom, responsibility, and reciprocity that once formed the system supporting moral architecture of modern social institutions. And those social institutions include the market economy. As social thinkers from Hegel, Durkheim, Hannah Arendt, and Axel Honneth to Robert Brandom have all in one way or another pointed out, the development of the contractual relationships between actors in market economies has served as a crucial mechanism for social integration and as an enabling medium for the actualization of social freedom. The boon of the broadening financial prosperity of the last few centuries has relied on the corollary development of democratic ways of life, as well as on the deepening of civil, political, and social rights. With their capacities for ubiquitous automation, anticipatory calculation, and infrastructural governance, AI systems will increasingly become asymmetrical drivers of economic growth and stability, irrespectively of these previously essential legitimating political conditions. This is a disentanglement, right, of the forms of democratic life and the mechanisms of economic success. In the near future, it will become very possible that political systems of algorithmic authoritarian rule provide quite comfortable lives for their computationally spawned, but consummately unfree citizens and subjects. The very real possibility of this material flourishing of digital despotism brings us. It brings us to the sharp end of the civilizational tipping point. For it evokes perhaps the greatest species historical challenge that humanity now faces, namely the dangerous disconnect between the global, indeed biospherical scale of the social and ethical impacts of emerging AI technologies and the intractable tendencies to parochialism, over localism that enable the geopolitical appropriation of AI for the advancement of localized political, national, and economic interests. When leadership and innovation is defined exclusively in terms of winning the geopolitical race for technological supremacy in the ends of driving economic growth, protecting state interests, and ensuring national security, the planetary ethical stakes of emerging AI technologies are perforce cast aside in kind. What makes such a techno-nationalist point of view so ignorant and alarming is that in condoning a geopolitics of division, by escalating the triumviralist race for technological ascendancy, it in fact inordinately raises the stakes of the potential for outbreaks of future conflict triggered by global technological competitors. Instead of building inclusive and international AI governance regimes that secure the responsible and design and humane development of AI, and that seek to protect human subjects from the abusive exercise of computational biopower, the one-sided pursuit of economic or geopolitical advantage in the race for AI innovation only sets humanity farther down a perilous path towards the expansion of global inequality, towards the strengthening of digital autocracy, and towards the multiplication of catastrophic possibilities. A geopolitical sprint to some non-existent technological finish line will only widen the growing digital divide between the tech-advanced and data-wealthy nations of the global north and the data-alienated and broadband-deprived nations of the global south. This will create increasing global instability and make large swaths of humankind vulnerable to the predatory proliferation of pandemics, of an AI-enabled disinformation, and to novel shapes of digital despotism. It will also dramatically increase the possibility for technologically enhanced and planetary scale conflict. As innovation, clustering, and spawning technologies which have already enabled rapid progress in biospherically impacting fields, such as geoengineering, biotechnology, and synthetic biology, AI systems are now opening up new possibilities for destructive struggles at an unprecedented scale. In virtue of the accelerating pace of digital innovation, propelled by the hasty pursuit of competitive advantage, such conflicts will soon pose very real danger to the future of life itself. Dangers ranging from calamitous cyber attacks on infrastructural vulnerabilities, algorithmically streamlined biological warfare, and human enhancement arms races, to smart nuclear terrorism and to the potentially genocidal proliferation of lethal autonomous weapons. Let me conclude here then by suggesting that in considering the choice between pursuing a geopolitics of technological supremacy and embracing a more planetary vision of AI innovation as a global public good, we must engage first in critical reflection on the greater intergenerational responsibility that attends our exceptional possession of the moral agency of that choice itself. It is a choice not simply about the values and qualities that will shape the future prospects for future flourishing of life, but even more fundamentally about whether or not we, us contemporaries of this world, are at bottom capable of collectively upholding the worth of our very survival. For as humankind now stands at the precipice of this civilizational tipping point, we do so as a dangerous species. We are a species that is, on the one hand, unconstrained in its pursuit of the boundless possibilities opened by the infinite generativity of its language, of its capacity for representation, of its capacity for symbolic experience. And yet we are a species which, for precisely that reason, is uniquely equipped with the intellectual competences to create the conditions of possibility for its own extermination and for the total destruction of the biosphere itself. The question then remains, how do we responsibly wield this primordially creative but potentially lethal power? Do we yield it as a power over life, a power situated in what the philosopher Martin Heidegger called the naked industriousness of the modern technological worldview, a power that enframes and objectifies the entirety of the natural world as mere standing reserve, and that orders and exploits all of its living and inert resources at whim? Do we follow in the footsteps of our industrious forebears, who first tore through the living tissue of the earth to harvest the fossil fuels that powered the great machines of the industrial age? Do we proceed apace down this path of human enterprise, and through our relentless carbonification of the atmosphere, our deforestation of the planet, and our morbid reverence for limitless growth and accumulation, continue to irretrievably tamper with the viability of our climate, to poison our soil, oceans, and air, and to enact an elimination of biodiversity at a rate of obliteration that is now surpassing the pace of the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction 65 million years ago? Or do we harness this poetic power as something else, not necessarily as a springboard to the greatest bad and to the totalizing mortification of the living, but rather as a wellspring for the summum bonum and for an affirmation of the intrinsic worth of life itself? For we are not just a dangerous species, readily capacitated to effect planetary self-annihilation. We are at the same time an ethical species, a species endowed with recourse to the media of collaboration, communication, and criticism, by means of which we are able to constrain our penchant for technological triumphalism and to sustain the futurity and flourishing of our species whole. A species endowed with a deep historically ingrained sense of responsibility to the intrinsic worth of life as such, and hence capable of stewarding the sustenance of our shared biosphere as its trustees and as its guardians. And so finally, in choosing between a geopolitics of technological supremacy in AI and a vision of AI innovation as a global public utility, I would argue that we have a transgenerational responsibility to take up this biocentric point of view and to err on the side of condoning the latter. Seen as a global public utility, AI industries would be subjected to the proactive adjustment of the regulatory perimeter on a worldwide scale. This would require the cooperative formation of a network of nonpartisan and inclusive international agencies that set gold standards for the responsible design and deployment of AI systems, limit catastrophic possibilities by setting up policing regimes, and put in place mechanisms for third-party audits of the safety, reliability, and equity of algorithmic systems. It would also require buy-in from governmental agencies to adopt and to put in force these standards and auditing measures. Now, admittedly, this path will demand a miraculous closing of the gap between the ideal and the real. A volte-face, a turnaround that is at radical cross purposes with the prevailing attitudes of statist and nationalist regimes. And yet, while the stubborn machinations of realpolitik seem to make the choice of geopolitical competition a foregone conclusion, I would enjoin to the contrary that the only inevitability we face as we approach this civilizational tipping point is that, for better or worse, the choice itself must be made. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for your inspiring lecture and forcing us to have to reflect on how we are using this impressive technology, how we have been using it, and how we may use it. And as different people start placing their questions on the chat, I like to take the idea of being the moderator to be able to ask the first question. I would just ask the people that host the Zoom call that if they can silence the other participants in such a way that I can actually see you, because right now I see someone named Gemaleon rather than you, because she has her microphone open, something like that. But I'd like to start with something that you were mentioning more or less at the middle of your presentation. That was one of the most interesting things that I found from your presentation, which was this idea of how the continuous development of the technology behind AI could exacerbate global inequality, right? Like, so we know that if there's something that can describe the human race, is how unequal it is. And this is not something that remains constant throughout time, in terms of, like, there are moments and periods of time in which we become more equal or we become more unequal. And you present this idea that the technology deprived South and the technology rich North could just become even farther away. So yet you told us that there are many potential benefits from AI and data-driven innovations that could help us improve as a society and in general bridge this gap. So what do you think are the necessary elements that a country must have in order to further this better future, rather than descend towards a more separated and unequal society?
That's a great question, and a really difficult one as the first question. So thank you for that. So I think there are two levels to think about this. First, at the level of global political economy, but then also at the national level, which I think is the kind of, I would say, the second part of the question. So I think at the level of the global political economy, and they're related, by the way. I think at the level of the global political economy, we need to be really aware of the way in which critical infrastructures in the kind of digital environments are largely being being seized upon by these large multinational big tech corporations, right? So just think about the data infrastructure, for instance, right? Who has the most data in the world? Well, it's the companies that are the most valuable. They call them the FAMGA elite, right? Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, right?
And Silicon Valley types.
What is it?
The Silicon Valley types.
Exactly, Silicon Valley types. And even more so, it's not just that there's a kind of monopolistic control over data infrastructures. Think about information processing infrastructures. We also call it compute infrastructures, right? To train these large-scale data set-based models, you need so much processing power. And what these larger conglomerates have done over the past decade or so is they've built these kind of large systems of compute infrastructure, cloud computing and capacitation, to the point where national governments like the United States and in Europe are highly dependent upon private providers to provide the compute infrastructures, right? And so there's a problem here in the sense that the distribution of power in these cases has shifted towards these multinational corporations that are just extracting as much value as possible out of all of these dimensions of now service provision, right? So providing compute as a service, providing data as a service, and now more recently, providing AI itself, like modularized AI as a service. So these big companies are basically controlling this critical infrastructure. And so as the starting point of a story about inequality, we see right there that in a sense, there's an increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots. Look at the increase in value since COVID-19 broke out, right? Who has benefited from COVID-19? It's the providers of critical infrastructure, critical digital infrastructure, and you've got millions of people, tens of millions of people suffering around the world. And yet you've got these massive profits being made by these multinational companies. We're not setting ourselves up to win here. I mean, there's another story to be told from the East, which is there's closer relationships of some of the technology companies to government, and that creates a kind of different dynamic, but just as much centralization, just as much control of infrastructure. Now, how does one combat that? Now, thinking from the national level. Well, I can tell you from the position of being an advisor to government in the UK and also, working very closely with the Council of Europe now. First, the starting point is to start building critical infrastructure in data, build critical infrastructure in compute, develop skills internally so that one isn't reliant on vendors that are coming from the larger companies for the skills and resources. So there's a whole process, I think, of upskilling and internally developing data and compute infrastructure that will hopefully combat these trends towards increasing inequality on a larger scale. I know you've got, there's other issues about public trust and the ways in which, national governments might take the lead in this, because I think the public still has a good deal of, in different parts of the world, it has a good deal of distrust in the use of their data. And that's something that we all have to work on in the sense of democratically controlling both government and technology. So I don't think there's an easy answer to the question, but I think there are starting points to address it. And the talk on that I just gave and describing AI as a public utility is one way, right, to think about constraining those bigger operators of power, right? Because if you recalibrated the action of these companies and these providers in accordance with the public interest, then you would have a bit of a closing of the gap so that the provision of those services could be beneficial to the most vulnerable, the most marginalized in the population.
Certainly not an easy path, as you've been describing. And in that regard, I would like to ask some of the questions from the people that are joining us today in the Zoom call. Ricardo Rodriguez from Mineji, he is asking you that they are a national statistic office, and that like to get data sets from anyone holding information where they can generate other information of social value and public interest. Would you recommend the possibilities, within the possibilities you see, or any recommendation of how that could be done in an ethical way?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think first and foremost, as I mentioned before, I think the starting point is in building public trust that the use of data will be oriented sufficiently to in the public interest. And so I would really recommend not making the same mistakes that some countries have made, where it's been, let's just help ourselves to all this data that's available, not be transparent about it, don't tell anybody what we're doing with it. And then when the pardon my French, the shit hits the fan, suddenly you've got, you know, all of the controversy that the government, it's a surveillance state, and these public organizations are doing the wrong thing with data. I think the way to avoid that, the ethical way to approach it, is to start with a kind of community-led co-design of the data ecosystem, right? So to reach out to those who are going to be participating in the space that's generating data, and in engaging them, and sort of having the good dialogical interactions, the communication conversation with them to generate support. We call it public consent and social license for the gathering of data, because it's not what I found. And we do a lot of public engagement at the Alan Turing Institute, and what I found is the public in general are not against the use of their data for the social good. What they're against in general is not being consulted properly, and finding out too late that, you know, the government has been linking this data set with that data set, and making predictions or assessing individuals in ways that they find offensive or unjustifiable. And so I think that the answer that I would have to that is, first and foremost, start with building grassroots support among the population that will serve as the population of the data distribution. And then also, if I could add to that, abide by stringent mechanisms of data integrity and data governance. So there are a lot of really good frameworks for data governance and data protection out there. I think staying above board, you know, the Office for National Statistics in the UK has this great data governance framework called the 5 Safes program. There's a lot of other really good mechanisms for data governance and responsible data use, like the FAIR principles as well, in Europe. And so I would just recommend it has to be done transparently through good mechanisms of data governance and data protection, and with the proper public consent and social license of those who are going to be impacted by the use of the data.
So in that same regard, and you were more or less mentioning one of the examples from the UK Statistics Office, Edagi Gutarra, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, is asking you, is there a document with a code of ethics that can be used when applying artificial intelligence to analyze data produced by humans? If you could give him or her some recommendations regarding this idea.
Sure. I'm going to put a link in the chat to some things that that I've written that I would recommend. It's just my SSRN page, but the document in here that I would recommend is the Understanding Artificial Intelligence Ethics and Safety. So the Alan Turing Institute has written the public sector guidance for the responsible use of artificial intelligence, use and implementation of artificial intelligence systems, and in that document in there, it's basically it's got a kind of end-to-end machine learning lifecycle based, process-based governance framework for going about the responsible innovation workflow, engaging in the responsible innovation workflow. And so I would highly recommend, if not using that frame, using, you know, I mean, there are other practice-based frameworks, but definitely starting from a practice-based perspective that just doesn't like say there's 10 principles and then just leaves the innovation to itself. No, we need to engage the machine learning lifecycle as a socio-technical assemblage. In other words, when you are engaging in problem formulation and setting your target variables, the choices that you're making are extremely social and extremely political. So how do you name an outcome? How do you define an outcome? That choice is something that will have dramatic effects on the outcomes of your system. In the same way, for instance, if you're in pre-processing stage and you yourself are thinking about the feature space, if say you're using tabular data, and you're thinking about, well, how do I group a certain set of variables, or how do I disaggregate variables? The choices that we make about grouping variables even are ethical and socially implicated choices. And so one needs to think about each of the pressure points along the machine learning AI workflow as involving sort of ongoing, ethically ramifying decisions that need to be engaged in a reflective way.
Sorry, my bad. So regarding this idea, and a little bit focusing on regulation and the topics that you were covering before, there's another question in the chat regarding from Abel Alejandro Coronado, that he asks us, do you think that legislation should be enacted to force actors to comply with rules designed for the common good? So in other words, going beyond individual firms like big tech, ethics towards much more regulations specified in the laws?
I mean, maybe the sort of lens I look through on this one is that all law should be oriented to the common good, right? Because why do we have law? And all law, in a sense, I mean, there are those who would argue that law has both a positive quality, so the quality of being in effect and constraining behavior, but it also always has a normative quality, a quality that that has to do with the justifiability of the law. So that's perhaps a too theoretical way to put it, but I would say I think that we need to really have different levels of governing the technologies. So we definitely, I would say, need high-level statute or law that looks at innovation through a values-based lens. So starts from trying to protect the salient and basic rights that we have, and then once you get down to the more specific vectors, so say that's a horizontal view, cross-sectoral view. Once you get down to the specific verticals, the specific sectors, then you're going to need soft law instruments, other mechanisms of regulation that are more specific to the technology, more specific to the impact, the levels of impacts that are more risk-based. So I think it's not, there are stratifications that we need to think about, right? Securing horizontal principles that will sort of be able to govern the protection of basic rights and freedoms, right? So freedom of association, freedom of expression, privacy. There are kind of big picture principles that we need to really think about, but then we also need to get to the more granular level through forms of more vertical regulation, forms of vertical soft law that then help to govern the specific practices. So I think, I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but I do think there are, it's a complicated endeavor, but it should be a combination of binding and non-binding legal instruments in governance.
So in another regard, a little bit similar to the previous questions that had been raised, Irving Cabrera asks, which government or groups are doing a good job to responsibly adopt AI and machine learning and at the same time maintaining it ethical?
It's a good question. I mean, we can find examples of some sort of community-led projects that have really, made attempts to go about a responsible way of using data. I mean, I think in the UK example, which is where I do most of my work, I can tell you that there are a lot of government departments, such as, we work, for instance, with the Ministry of Justice, and they've really tried to not only be transparent about how they're using systems, algorithmic systems, but also to develop mechanisms that are cross organization. So from the data scientists at the organization straight through to the permanent secretaries, but that really govern the decision-making, the behavior with regard to the technology. I think we're at an early stage of trying to incorporate responsible innovation into the actual production of systems. And I think that's partially for a basic reason, which is that for quite a long time, there was what we would call an operational autonomy when it came to the production of the systems, right? So engineers and technologists were seen to be independent from the social environment, right? And it's probably been about, I don't know, I mean, a couple of decades now of real push to start to break down that boundary between people who think about the social and ethical impacts and people who sort of wash their hand, or they sort of wash their hands of it and say, I'm just an engineer, I'm just a scientist, I basically, you know, I build algorithms, right? And so I think we're coming to a time where that isn't sort of as realistic as it used to be, because there's increasing pressure to have ethical innovation as a guiding kind of factor in AI and machine learning.
So we're almost about to run out of time, but I wanted to ask one of the questions from Dr. Hugo Fuentes from Tec de Monterrey. I'm going to combine his question with one that I had regarding the use of data in the pandemic. So as all of you probably know, during the beginning of the pandemic, the idea of contact tracing became and one of the many tools that governments would start using to try and prevent the spread of the disease. And as the Asia Pacific countries started being more or less successful with that, there were different op-eds and like articles being written about the idea of like, what is the government doing with that information? What are the different people receiving that information, the different apps, the different things, and the risks that may come from the idea of like knowing data under your skin, that type of data. So that type of terminology, sorry. So the question Hugo presents is that as civilians or as common people, what can we do in order to ensure that this does not become an instrument that increases the power of specific groups?
Yeah, another I think tough question, just in the sense that there are so many things that have gone wrong with the digital contact tracing regimes, right? I mean, just think about in the UK and in Europe, they spent millions and millions of pounds and euros trying to come up with these kind of proximity tracing device APIs that ultimately had very little uptake against what was needed, that were poorly conceived in terms of instruments of public health. So they weren't properly thought about as part of the public health process. It was done with very little public consultation, very little citizen engagement about, you know, how people felt about these things. But the question, so that's one element of it, but the question that you're asking is really more about this idea of function creep or mission creep, which comes along with opening up possibilities for macro scale surveillance, right? Slowly but surely, by allowing government to collect and centralize the data. And I do think this is an issue. This is something that we need to be worried about in general, not least because there have been examples where governments have at first said, no data was going to be collected, you know, and say used by the police for some other reason. But suddenly we find out that actually there are these kind of little holes in the policy where if something happens, then the police can help themselves to this kind of location data from the digital contact tracing. So I think that's a very difficult scenario that we can only effectively combat at the level of citizens by demanding that there be full transparency and full accountability when it comes to the constraints that are put around those processes, right? So in the UK situation, we were really, I mean, there was a lot of concern about the sort of movement towards a centralized digital contact tracing system that could potentially use the data for other reasons. And the only way that it was resolved in the UK and also in other places was that the app that was used is entirely decentralized, and so there's no public health officials involved in any of the contact tracing. So it was fully privatized. that, I think that's the wrong direction too. I mean, we can't privatize public health. We need to find a way that confidence could have been built through public health agencies to use digital contact tracing. And I'll just quickly know, I know we're going at the end of this, but before COVID, digital contact tracing had been piloted as a public health e-health solution in various countries in Africa over the last, say, 15 years. And in these cases, they were relatively successful and embedded in public health processes in ways that are very different from the kind of, Google, Apple API at scale method that was used in COVID, which I think ultimately ended up being ineffectual and ultimately, I think, even undermined public trust in the public health system.
Well, I thank you very much for that question and for the response, David. It's definitely one of the many things that this impressive debate regarding the use of this technology presents us, and the type of discussions that we must have during this decade and the following years in many different countries around the world in a more globalized way, and rather than just trying to tackle the problem all on our own and at a national level, probably. I would like to thank you once again for being with us today from the UK, taking time of your loaded schedule to talk with us. And but yeah, basically, thank you everyone for coming over and hearing David's presentation. This has been a conference from the New Data and Methods series from both INEGI and Tec de Monterrey, and I would like just to thank everyone for coming over. And please, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, INEGI. Thank you, Tec, for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Have a great day. Take care. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.